Chapter 20 of Bardelys the Magnificent. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The BRAVI at BLAGNAC. I was glad to be in the open once more, glad of the movement, as I rode at the head of my brave company along the bank of the Garonne and in the shade of the golden, autumn-tinted trees. I was in a measure angry with myself that I had driven such a bargain with Roxelane, in a measure angry with her that she had forced me to do it by her obstinacy. A fine gentleman I, on my soul, to have dubbed Châteauroux a cheat for having done no worse than I had now brought myself to do. Yet was it so? No, I assured myself it was not. 1,000 times no. What I had done as much to win Roxelane to me as to win her from her own unreasonableness. In the days to come she should thank me for my harshness, for that which now she perhaps accounted my unfairness. Then again would I ask myself, was I very sure of this? And so the two questions were flung the one against the other. My conscience divided itself into two parties, and they waged a war that filled me with a depressing uncertainty. In the end, shame was overthrown, and I flung back my head with a snort of assurance. I was doing no wrong. On the contrary, I was doing right, both by myself and by Roxelane. What matter that I was really cheating her? What matter that I said I would not leave Lavedan until I had her promise, whilst in reality I had hurled my threat at Saint-Eustache that I would meet him at Toulouse, and passed my word to the Vicomtesse that I would succour her husband? I gave no thought to the hidden threat with which Saint-Eustache had retorted that from Lavedan to Toulouse was a distance of some 20 leagues. Had he been a man of sterner purposes, I might have been uneasy and on my guard. But Saint-Eustache, pshaw! It is ill to underestimate an enemy, be he never so contemptible, and for my disdain of the Chevalier I might have paid dearly had not fortune, which of late had been practising singular jests upon me after seemingly abandoning me, returned to my aid at the last moment. It was Saint-Eustache's purpose that I should never reach Toulouse alive, for in all the world I was the one man he feared, the one man who would encompass his undoing and destruction by a word. And so he had resolved and disposed that I should be removed, and to accomplish this he had left a line of BRAVI along the road I was to pass. He had counted upon my lying the night in one of the intervening towns, for the journey was overlong to be accomplished at a stretch, and wherever I might chance to lie, there I should have to reckon with his assassins. The nearer Toulouse, although I knew not this, the thicker grew my danger. Into the very thick of it I rode, in the very thick of it I lay, and all that came of it was that I obtained possession of one more and overwhelming piece of evidence against my murderous chevalier. But I outrun my story. It had been my purpose to change horses at Grenade, and so push on and reach Toulouse that very night, or in the early hours of the following morning. At Grenade, however, there were no horses to be obtained, at least not more than 3, and so, leaving the greater portion of my company behind, I set out, escorted only by Gillet and Antoine. Night had fallen long before we reached Les Penas, and with it came foul weather. The wind rose from the west, grew to the violence of a hurricane, and brought with it such a deluge of cold, cutting rain as never had it been my ill chance to ride through. From Les Penas to Fanoué the road dips frequently, and wherever this occurred it seemed to us that we were riding in a torrent, our horses fetlock deep in mud. Antoine complained in groans. Gillet growled openly, and went the length of begging me, as we rode through the ill-paved, flooded streets of Fanoué, to go no farther. But I was adamant in my resolve. Soaked to the skin, my clothes hanging sodden about me, and chilled to the marrow though I was, I set my chattering teeth and swore that we should not sleep until we reached Toulouse. "My God," he groaned, "and we but half-way." "Forward," was all I answered, and so as midnight chimed we left Fanoué behind us, and dashed on into the open country and the full fury of the tempest. My servants came after me upon their stumbling horses, whining and cursing by turns, and forgetting in their misery the respect that they were accustomed to pay me. I think now that it was a providence that guided me. Had I halted at Fanway, as they would have had me do, it is odds that this chronicle would never have been penned, for likely enough I had had my throat cut as I slept. A providence was it also that brought my horse down within a half-mile of Blagnac, and so badly did it founder that it might not be ridden farther. The beasts my men bestrode were in little better condition, and so, with infinite chagrin, I was forced to acknowledge defeat and to determine that at Blagnac we should lie for the remainder of the night. After all, it mattered little. A couple of hours' riding in the morning would bring us to Toulouse, and we would start betimes. I bade Gillet dismount. He had been the louder in his complainings, and follow us afoot, bringing my horse to the Auberge de l'Etoile at Blagnac, where he would await him. Then I mounted his jaded beast, and accompanied by Antoine, the last of my retainers, I rode into Blagnac and pulled up at the sign of the Star. With my whip I smote the door, and I had need to smite hard if I would be heard above the wind that shrieked and howled under the eaves of that narrow street. Yet it almost seemed as if someone were expected, for scarce had my knocking ceased when the door was opened and the landlord stood there, shading a taper with his hand. For a moment I saw the glow of its light on his rosy, white-bearded face, then a gust of wind extinguished it. "Diable," he swore, "an ugly night for travelling," adding as an afterthought, "You ride late, monsieur." "You are a man of supreme discernment, Monsieur L'Hôte," I said testily, as I pushed him aside and stepped into the passage. "Will you keep me in the rain till daylight whilst you perpend how late I ride? Is your ostler abed? See to those beasts yourself, then. Afterwards, get me food. For me and for my man, and beds for both of us." "I have but one room, monsieur," he answered respectfully. "You shall have that, and your servant shall sleep in the hayloft." "My servant sleeps in my room, if you have but one. Set a mattress on the floor for him. Is this a night to leave a dog to sleep in a hayloft? I have another servant following. He will be here in a few minutes. You must find room for him also, in the passage outside my door, if no other accommodation be possible." "But, monsieur," he began in a tone of protest, which I set down to the way a landlord has of making difficulties that he shall be the better paid for such lodging as he finds us. "See to it," I ordered peremptorily. "You shall be well paid. Now go tend those horses." On the wall of the passage fell a warm reddish glow from the common room, which argued a fire, and this was too alluring to admit of my remaining longer in discussion with him. I strode forward, therefore. The Auberge de l'Etoile was not an imposing hostelry, nor one at which from choice I had made a halt. This common room stank most vilely of oil, of burning tallow, from the smoky tapers, and of I know not what other noisome unsavourynesses. As I entered, I was greeted by a resonant snore from a man seated in a corner by the fire. His head had fallen back, displaying the brown, sinewy neck, and he slept, or seemed to sleep, with mouth wide open. Full length on the hearth, and in the red glare of the burning logs, lay what at first glance I took to be a heap of rags, but which closer scrutiny showed me to be another man seemingly asleep also. I flung my sodden castor on the table. I dropped my drenched cloak on the ground, and stepped with a heavy tread and a noisy rattle of spurs across the floor. Yet my ragged gentleman slept on. I touched him lightly with my whip. "Hold, mon bonhomme," I cried to him. Still he did not move, whereat I lost patience and caught him a kick full in the side, so choicely aimed that first it doubled him up, then brought him into a sitting posture with the snarl of a cross-grained dog that has been rudely aroused. From out of an evil, dirty countenance a pair of gloomy, bloodshot eyes scowled threateningly upon me. The man on the chair awoke at the same instant and sat forward. "Eh bien," said I to my friend on the hearth, "will you stir yourself?" "For whom?" he growled. "Is not the Etoile as much for me as for you, whoever you may be?" "We have paid our lodging, pardieu," swore he of the chair. "My masters," said I grimly, "if you have not eyes to see my sodden condition, and if you therefore have not the grace to move that I may approach the fire, I'll see to it that you spend the night not only à la toile, but à la belle à toile." With much pleasantry and a touch of the foot, I moved my friend aside. My tone was not nice, nor do I generally have the air of promising more than I can fulfill. They were growling together in a corner when Antoine came to draw off my doublet and my boots. They were still growling when Gillet joined us presently, although at his coming they paused to take his measure with their eyes. For Gillet was something of a giant, and men were wont to turn their heads, aye, and women too, to admire his fine proportions. We supped, so vilely that I have not the heart to tell you what we ate, and having supped, I bade my host light me to my chamber. As for my men, I had determined that they should spend the night in the common room, where there was a fire, and where, notwithstanding the company of those two ruffians, into whose presence I had not troubled to inquire, they would doubtless be better than elsewhere in that poor hostelry. In gathering up my cloak and doublet and other effects to bear them off to the kitchen, the host would have possessed himself also of my sword. But with a laugh I took it from him, remarking that it required no drying. As we mounted the stairs, I heard something above me that sounded like the creaking of a door. The host heard it also, for he stood suddenly still, his glance very questioning. "What was that?" said he. "The wind, I should say," I answered idly, and my answer seemed to reassure him, for with a, yes, the wind," he went on. Now, for all that, I am far from being a man of tremors or unwarranted fears. To tell the truth, the hostelry of the Star was beginning to fret my nerves. I could scarcely have told you why, had you asked me, as I sat upon the bed after mine host had left me and turned my thoughts to it. It was none of the trivial incidents that had marked my coming, but it was, I think, the combination of them all. First, there was the host's desire to separate me from my men by suggesting that they should sleep in the hayloft. Clearly unnecessary when he was not averse to turning his common room into a dormitory. There was his very evident relief when, after announcing that I should have them sleep one in my room and one in the passage by my door, I consented to their spending the night below. There was the presence of those two very ill-looking cutthroats. There was the attempt to carry off my sword, and lastly, there was that creaking door and the host's note of alarm. What was that? I stood up suddenly. Had my fancy, dwelling upon that very incident, tricked me into believing that a door had creaked again? I listened, but a silence followed, broken only by a drone of voices ascending from the common room. As I had assured the host upon the stairs, so I now assured myself that it was the wind, the signboard of the inn perhaps, swaying in the storm. And then, when I had almost dismissed my doubts and was about to divest myself of my remaining clothes, I saw something at which I thanked heaven that I had not allowed the landlord to carry off my rapier. My eyes were on the door, and as I gazed, I beheld the slow rising of the latch. It was no delusion. My wits were keen and my eyes sharp. There was no fear to make me see things that were not. Softly I stepped to the bed-rail where I had hung my sword by the baldric, and as softly I unsheathed it. The door was pushed open, and I caught the advance of a stealthy step. A naked foot shot past the edge of the door into my room, and for a second I thought of pinning it to the ground with my rapier. Then came a leg, then a half-dressed body surmounted by a face, the face of Rodinard. At sight of it, amazed and 100 suspicions crossed my mind. How in God's name came he here, and for what purpose did he steal so into my chamber? But my suspicions perished even as they were begotten. There was so momentous, so alarmingly warning a look on his face as he whispered the one word, "Monseigneur," that clearly, if danger there was to me, it was not from him. "What the devil—" I began, but at the sound of my voice the alarm grew in his eyes. "Shh!" he whispered, his finger on his lips. "Be silent, Monseigneur, for heaven's sake." Very softly he closed the door. Softly, yet painfully, he hobbled forward to my side. "There is a plot to murder you, monseigneur," he whispered. "What? Here at Blagnac?" He nodded fearfully. "Bah," I laughed. "You rave, man. Who was to know that I was to come this way? And who is there to plot against my life?" "Monsieur de Saint-Eustache," he answered. "And for the rest, as to expecting you here, they did not, but they were prepared against the remote chance of your coming. From what I have gathered, there is not a hostelry betwixt this and Lavdan at which the Chevalier has not left his cutthroats, with the promise of enormous reward to the men who shall kill you." I caught my breath at that. My doubts vanished. "Tell me what you know," said I. "Be brief." Thereupon this faithful dog, whom I had so sorely beaten but 4 nights ago, told me how, upon finding himself able to walk once more, he had gone to seek me out, that he might implore me to forgive him and not cast him off altogether, after a lifetime spent in the service of my father and of myself. He had discovered from Monsieur de Castelrue that I was gone to Lavdan, and he determined to follow me thither. He had no horse and little money, and so he had set out afoot that very day and dragged himself as far as Blagnac, where, however, his strength had given out and he was forced to halt. A providence it seemed that this had so befallen, for here at the Étoile he had that evening overheard Saint-Eustache in conversation with those 2 BRAVI below stairs. It would seem from what he had said that at every hostelry from Grenade to Toulouse, at which it was conceivable that I might spend the night, the Chevalier had made a similar provision. At Blagnac, if I got so far without halting, I must arrive very late, and therefore the Chevalier had bidden his men await me until daylight. He did not believe, however, that I should travel so far, for he had seen to it that I should find no horses at the post-houses. But it was just possible that I might, nevertheless, push on, and Saint-Eustache would let no possibility be overlooked. Here at Blagnac the landlord, Rodinard informed me, was also in Saint-Eustache's pay. Their intention was to stab me as I slept. "Monseigneur," he ended, "knowing what danger awaited you along the road, I have sat up all night, praying God and his saints that you might come this far, and that thus I might warn you. Had I been less bruised and sore, I had got myself a horse and ridden out to meet you. As it was, I could but hope and pray that you would reach Blagnac, and that—" I gathered him into my arms at that, but my embrace drew a groan from him, for the poor faithful knave was very sore. "My poor Ganymede," I murmured, and I was more truly moved to sympathy, I think, than ever I had been in all my selfish life. Hearing his sobriquet, a look of hope gleamed suddenly in his eye. "You will take me back, monseigneur?" he pleaded. "You will take me back, will you not? I swear that I will never let my tongue—" "Shh, my good Ganymede. Not only will I take you back, but I shall strive to make amends for my brutality. Come, my friend, you shall have 20 gold louis to buy unguents for your poor shoulders." "Monseigneur is very good," he murmured, whereupon I would have embraced him again, but that he shivered and drew back. "No, no, monseigneur," he whispered fearfully. "It is a great honor, but it pains me to be touched." "Then I will take the will for the deed. And now for these gentlemen below stairs." I rose and moved to the door. "Order Gillet to beat their brains out," was Ganymede's merciful suggestion. I shook my head. "We might be detained for doing murder. We have no proof yet of their intentions. I think—" An idea flashed suddenly across my mind. "Go back to your room, Ganymede," I bade him. "Lock yourself in, and do not stir until I call you. I do not wish their suspicions aroused." I opened the door, and as Ganymede obediently slipped past me and vanished down the passage, "Monsieur L'Hôte," I called. "Ho there, Gillet." "Monsieur," answered the landlord. "Monseigneur," replied Gillet, and there came a stir below. "Is aught amiss?" the landlord questioned, a note of concern in his voice. "Amiss?" I echoed peevishly, mincing my words as I uttered them. "Pardie, must I be put to it to undress myself whilst those two lazy dogs of mine are snoring beneath me? Come up this minute, Gillet. And," I added as an afterthought, "you had best sleep here in my room." "At once, monseigneur," answered he, but I caught the faintest tinge of surprise in his accents, for never yet had it fallen to the lot of sturdy, clumsy Gillet to assist me at my toilette. The landlord muttered something, and I heard Gillet whispering his reply. Then the stairs creaked under his heavy tread. In my room I told him in half a dozen words what was afoot. For answer, he swore a great oath that the landlord had mulled a stoup of wine for him, which he never doubted now was drugged. I bade him go below and fetch the wine, telling the landlord that I too had a fancy for it. "But what of Antoine?" he asked. "They will drug him." "Let them. We can manage this affair, you and I, without his help. If they did not drug him, they might haply stab him, so that in being drugged lies his safety." As he bade him, so he did, and presently he returned with a great steaming measure. This I emptied into a ewer, then returned it to him that he might take it back to the host with my thanks and our appreciation. Thus should we give him confidence that the way was clear and smooth for them. Thereafter there befell precisely that which already you will be expecting, and nothing that you cannot guess. It was, perhaps, at the end of an hour's silent waiting that one of them came. We had left the door unbarred so that his entrance was unhampered. But scarce was he within, when out of the dark on either side of him rose Gillet and I. Before he had realized it, he was lifted off his feet and deposited upon the bed without a cry, the only sound being the tinkle of the knife that dropped from his suddenly unnerved hand. On the bed, with Gillet's great knee in his stomach and Gillet's hands at his throat, he was assured in unequivocal terms that at his slightest outcry we would make an end of him. I kindled a light. We trussed him hand and foot with the bedclothes, and then, whilst he lay impotent and silent in his terror, I proceeded to discuss the situation with him. I pointed out that we knew that what he had done at St. Eustache's instigation. Therefore, the true guilt was St. Eustache's, and upon him alone the punishment would fall. But ere this could come to pass, he himself must add his testimony to ours, mine and Rodinar's. If he would come to Toulouse and do that, make a full confession of how he had been set to do this murdering, the Chevalier de St. Eustache, who was the real culprit, should be the only one to suffer the penalty of the law. If he would not do that, why then he must stand the consequences himself, and the consequences would be the hangman. But in either case he was coming to Toulouse in the morning. It goes without saying that he was reasonable. I never for a moment held his judgment in doubt. There is no loyalty about a cutthroat, and it is not the way of his calling to take unnecessary risk. We had just settled the matter in a mutually agreeable manner when the door opened again, and his confederate, rendered uneasy no doubt by his long absence, came to see what could be occasioning this unconscionable delay in the slitting of the throats of a pair of sleeping men. Beholding us there in friendly conclave, and no doubt considering that under the circumstances his intrusion was nothing short of an impertinence, that polite gentleman uttered a cry, which I should like to think was an apology, for having disturbed us, and turned to go with most indecorous precipitancy. But Gillet took him by the nape of his dirty neck and haled him back into the room. In less time than it takes me to tell of it, he lay beside his colleague, and was being asked whether he did not think that he might also come to take the same view of the situation. Overjoyed that we intended no worse by him, he swore by every saint in the calendar that he would do our will, that he had reluctantly undertaken the Chevalier's business, that he was no cutthroat, but a poor man with a wife and children to provide for. And that, in short, was how it came to pass that the Chevalier de St. Eustache himself, by disposing for my destruction, disposed only for his own. With these two witnesses, and Rodinard to swear how St. Eustache had bribed them to cut my throat, With myself and Gelée to swear how the attempt had been made and frustrated, I could now go to His Majesty with a very full confidence, not only of having the Chevalier's accusations, against whomsoever they might be, discredited, but also of sending the Chevalier himself to the gallows he had so richly earned. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Bardelys the Magnificent. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Louis the Just. "For me," said the king, "these depositions were not necessary. Your word, my dear Marcel, would have sufficed. For the courts, however, perhaps it is well that you have had them taken. Moreover, they form a valuable corroboration of the treason which you laid to the charge of Monsieur de Saint-Eustache." We were standing, at least Lafosse and I were standing, Louis XIII sat, in a room of the Palace of Toulouse, where I had had the honor of being brought before His Majesty. Lafosse was there because it would seem that the king had grown fond of him, and could not be without him since his coming to Toulouse. His Majesty was, as usual, so dull and weary, not even roused by the approaching trial of Montmorency, which was the main business that had brought him south, that even the company of this vapid, shallow, but irrepressibly good-humoured Lafosse, with his everlasting mythology, proved a thing desirable. "I will see," said Louis, "that your friend the Chevalier is placed under arrest at once, and as much for his attempt upon your life as for the unstable quality of his political opinions. The law shall deal with him conclusively." He sighed. "It always pains me to proceed to extremes against a man of his stamp. To deprive a fool of his head seems a work of supererogation." I inclined my head and smiled at his pleasantry. Louis the Just rarely permitted himself to jest, and when he did, his humour was as like unto humour as water is like unto wine. Still, when a monarch jests, if you are wise, if you have a favour to sue, or a position at court to seek or to maintain, you smile, for all that the ineptitude of his witless wit be rather provocative of sorrow. "Nature needs meddling with at times," hazarded Lafosse from behind His Majesty's chair. "This Saint-Eustache is a sort of Pandora's box, which it is well to close, ere go to the devil," said the king shortly. "We are not jesting. We have to do justice." "Ah, justice," murmured Lafosse. "I have seen pictures of the lady. She covers her eyes with a bandage, but is less discreet where the other beauties of her figure are in question." His Majesty blushed. He was above all things a chaste-minded man, modest as a nun. To the immodesty rampant about him, he was in the habit of closing his eyes and his ears, until the flagrancy or the noise of it grew to proportions to which he might remain neither blind nor deaf. "Monsieur de la Fosse," said he in an austere voice, "you weary me, and when people weary me, I send them away, which is one of the reasons why I am usually so much alone. I beg that you would glance at that hunting book, so that when I have done with Monsieur de Bardelys, you may give me your impressions of it." Lafosse fell back, obedient but unabashed, and moving to a table by the window, he opened the book Louis had pointed out. "Now, Marcel, while that buffoon prepares to inform me that the book has been inspired by Diana herself, tell me what else you have to tell." "Naught else, sire." "How naught? What of this Vicomte de Lavedan?" "Surely your Majesty is satisfied that there is no charge, no heedful charge against him." "Aye, but there is a charge, a very heedful one, and so far you have afforded me no proofs of his innocence to warrant my sanctioning his enlargement." "I had thought, sire, that it would be unnecessary to advance proofs of his innocence until there were proofs of his guilt to be refuted. It is unusual, your Majesty, to apprehend a gentleman so that he may show cause why he did not deserve such apprehension. The more usual course is to arrest him because there are proofs of his guilt to be preferred against him." Louis combed his beard pensively, and his melancholy eyes grew thoughtful. "A nice point, Marcel," said he, and he yawned. "A nice point. You should have been a lawyer." Then, with an abrupt change of manner, "Do you give me your word of honor that he is innocent?" he asked sharply. "If your Majesty's judges offer proof of his guilt, I will give you my word that I will tear that proof to pieces." "That is not an answer. Do you swear his innocence?" "Do I know what he carries in his conscience?" quoth I, still fencing with the question. "How can I give my word in such a matter?" "Ah, sire, it is not for nothing that they call you Louis the Just," I pursued, adopting cajolery and presenting him with his own favourite phrase. "You will never allow a man against whom there is no shred of evidence to be confined in prison." "Is there not?" he questioned. Yet his tone grew gentler. History, he had promised himself, should know him as Louis the Just, and he would do naught that might jeopardize his claim to that proud title. "There is evidence of this St. Eustache." "Would your Majesty hang a dog upon the word of that double traitor?" You are a great advocate, Marcel. You avoid answering questions. You turn questions aside by counter-questions." He seemed to be talking more to himself than to me. "You are a much better advocate than the Vicomte's wife, for instance. She answers questions and has a temper. Ciel, what a temper!" "You have seen the Vicomtesse?" I exclaimed, and I grew cold with apprehension, knowing as I did the license of that woman's tongue. "Seen her?" he echoed whimsically. "I have seen her, heard her, well-nigh felt her. The air of this room is still disturbed as a consequence of her presence. She was here an hour ago." "And it seemed," lisped Lafosse, turning from his hunting-book, "as if the 3 daughters of Acheron had quitted the domain of Pluto to take embodiment in a single woman." "I would not have seen her," the king resumed as though Lafosse had not spoken, "but she would not be denied. I heard her voice blaspheming in the antechamber when I refused to receive her. There was a commotion at my door. It was dashed open, and the Swiss who held it was hurled into my room as though he had been a mannequin. Dieu! Since I have reigned in France, I have not been the centre of so much commotion. She is a strong woman. Marcel, the saints defend you hereafter when she shall come to be your mother-in-law. In all France, I'll swear, her tongue is the only stouter thing than her arm. But she's a fool." "What did she say, sire?" I asked in my anxiety. "Say? She swore. Ciel, how she did swear! Not a saint in the calendar would she let rest in peace. She dragged them all by turns from their chapter rolls to bear witness to the truth of what she said." "That was?" "That her husband was the foulest traitor out of hell, but that he was a fool with no wit of his own to make him accountable for what he did, and that out of folly he had gone astray. Upon those grounds she besought me to forgive him and let him go. When I told her that he must stand his trial, and that I could offer her but little hope of his acquittal, she told me things about myself which in my conceit, and thanks to you flatterers who have surrounded me, I had never dreamed. She told me I was ugly, sour-faced, and malformed, that I was priest-ridden and a fool, unlike my brother, who, she assured me, is a mirror of chivalry and manly perfections. She promised me that heaven should never receive my soul, though I told my beads from now till doomsday. And she prophesied for me a welcome among the damned when my time comes. What more she might have foretold, I cannot say. She wearied me at last, for all her novelty, and I dismissed her. That is to say," he amended, "I ordered 4 musketeers to carry her out. God pity you, Marcel, when you become her daughter's husband." But I had no heart to enter into his jocularity. This woman with her ungovernable passion and her rash tongue had destroyed everything. "I see no likelihood of becoming her daughter's husband," I answered mournfully. The king looked up and laughed. "Down on your knees, then," said he, "and render thanks to heaven." But I shook my head very soberly. "To your Majesty, it is a pleasing comedy," said I, "but to me, alas, it is nearer far to tragedy." "Come, Marcel," said he, "may I not laugh a little? One grows so sad with being King of France. Tell me what vexes you." "Mademoiselle de Lavedan has promised that she will marry me only when I have saved her father from the scaffold. I came to do it very full of hope, sire, but his wife has forestalled me and seemingly doomed him irrevocably." His glance fell. His countenance resumed its habitual gloom. Then he looked up again, and in the melancholy depths of his eyes I saw a gleam of something that was very like affection. "You know that I love you, Marcel," he said gently. "Were you my own son, I could not love you more. You are a profligate, dissolute knave, and your scandals have rung in my ears more than once, yet you are different from these other fools, and at least you have never wearied me. To have done that is to have done something. I would not lose you, Marcel, as lose you I shall if you marry this Rose of Languedoc, for I take it that she is too sweet a flower to let wither in the stale atmosphere of courts. This man, this Vicomte de Lavedan, has earned his death. Why should I not let him die, since, if he dies, you will not wed?" "Do you ask me why, sire?" said I. "Because they call you Louis the Just, and because no king was ever more deserving of the title." He winced. He pursed his lips and shot a glance at Lafosse, who was deep in the mysteries of his volume. Then he drew towards him a sheet of paper, and taking a quill, he sat toying with it. "Because they call me the Just, I must let justice take its course," he answered presently. "But," I objected, with a sudden hope, "the course of justice cannot lead to the headsman in the case of the Vicomte de Lavedan." "Why not?" And his solemn eyes met mine across the table. "Because he took no active part in the revolt. If he was a traitor, he was no more than a traitor at heart, and until a man commits a crime in deed, he is not amenable to the law's rigor. His wife has made his defection clear, but it were unfair to punish him in the same measure as you punished those who bore arms against you, sire." "Ah," he pondered. "Well, what more?" "Is that not enough, sire?" I cried. My heart beat quickly, and my pulses throbbed with the suspense of that portentous moment. He bent his head, dipped his pen, and began to write. "What punishment would you have me mete out to him?" he asked as he wrote. "Come, Marcel, deal fairly with me, and deal fairly with him, for as you deal with him, so shall I deal with you through him." I felt myself paling in my excitement. "There is banishment, sire. It is usual in cases of treason that are not sufficiently flagrant to be punished by death." "Yes." He wrote busily. "Banishment for how long, Marcel? For his lifetime?" "Nay, sire, that were too long." "For my lifetime, then?" "Again, that were too long." He raised his eyes and smiled. "Ah, you turn prophet? Well, for how long, then? Come, man." "I should think 5 years." "5 years be it. Say no more." He wrote on for a few moments. Then he raised the sandbox and sprinkled the document. "Tiens," he cried, as he dusted it and held it out to me. "There is my warrant for the disposal of Monsieur le Vicomte Léon de Lavedan. He is to go into banishment for 5 years, but his estate shall suffer no sequestration, and at the end of that period he may return and enjoy them. We hope with better loyalty than in the past. Get them to execute that warrant at once, and see that the Vicomte starts today under escort for Spain. It will also be your warrant to Mademoiselle de Lavedan, and will afford proof to her that your mission has been successful." "Sire," I cried, and in my gratitude I could say no more, but I sank on my knee before him and raised his hand to my lips. "There," said he in a fatherly voice, "go now and be happy." As I rose, he suddenly put up his hand. "Ma foi, I had all but forgotten, so much as Monsieur de Lavedan's fate preoccupied us." He picked up another paper from his table and tossed it to me. It was my note of hand to Châteauroux for my Picardy estates. "Châteauroux died this morning," the king pursued. "He had been asking to see you, but when he was told that you had left Toulouse, he dictated a long confession of his misdeeds, which he sent to me together with this note of yours. He could not, he wrote, permit his heirs to enjoy your estates. He had not won them. He had really forfeited his own stakes, since he had broken the rules of play. He has left me to deliver judgment in the matter of his own lands passing into your possession. What do you say to it, Marcel?" It was almost with reluctance that I took up that scrap of paper. It had been so fine and heroic a thing to have cast my wealth to the winds of heaven for love's sake, that on my soul I was loath to see myself master of more than Beaugency. Then a compromise suggested itself. "The wager, sire," said I, "is one that I take shame in having entered upon. That shame made me eager to pay it, although fully conscious that I had not lost. But even now I cannot, in any case, accept the forfeit Châteauroux is willing to suffer. Shall we forget that the wager was ever laid?" "The decision does you honor. It was what I had hoped from you. Go now, Marcel. I doubt me you are eager. When your love-sickness wanes a little, we shall hope to see you at court again." I sighed. "Alas, sire, that would be never." "So you said once before, monsieur. It is a foolish spirit upon which to enter into matrimony, yet, like many follies, a fine one. Adieu, Marcel." "Adieu, sire." I had kissed his hands. I had poured forth my thanks. I had reached the door already, and he was in the act of turning to La Fosse, when it came into my head to glance at the warrant he had given me. He noticed this and my sudden halt. "Is aught amiss?" he asked. You have omitted something, sire," I ventured, and I returned to the table. "I am already so grateful that I hesitate to ask an additional favor. Yet it is but troubling you to add a few strokes of the pen, and it will not materially affect the sentence itself." He glanced at me, and his brows drew together as he sought to guess my meaning. "Well, man, what is it?" he demanded impatiently. "It has occurred to me that this poor Vicomte, in a strange land, alone among strange faces, missing the loved ones that for so many years he had seen daily by his side, will be pitiably lonely." The king's glance was lifted suddenly to my face. "Must I then banish his family as well?" "All of it will not be necessary, Your Majesty." For once his eyes lost their melancholy, and as hearty a burst of laughter as ever I heard from that poor weary gentleman he vented then. "Ciel, what a jester you are! Ah, but I shall miss you!" he cried, as seizing the pen he added the word I craved of him. "Are you content at last?" he asked, returning the paper to me. I glanced at it. The warrant now stipulated that Madame la Vicomtesse de Lavedan should bear her husband company in his exile. "Sire, you are too good," I murmured. "Tell the officer to whom you entrust the execution of this warrant that he will find the lady in the guard-room below, where she is being detained pending my pleasure. Did she but know that it was your pleasure she has been waiting upon, I should tremble for your future when the 5 years expire." End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Bardelys the Magnificent. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. We Unsaddle. Mademoiselle held the royal warrant of her father's banishment in her hand. She was pale, and her greeting of me had been timid. I stood before her, and by the door stood Rodinard, whom I had bidden attend me. As I had approached Lavedan that day, I had been taken with a great and overwhelming shame at the bargain I had driven. I had pondered, and it had come to me that she had been right to suggest that in matters of love What is not freely given, it is not worth while to take. And out of my shame and that conclusion had sprung a new resolve, so that nothing might weaken it, and lest, after all, the sight of Roxelane should bring me so to desire her that I might be tempted to override my purpose, I had deemed it well to have the restraint of a witness at our last interview. To this end had I bidden Ganymede follow me into the very salon. She read the document to the very end. Then her glance was raised timidly again to mine, and from me it shifted to Ganymede, stiff at his post by the door. "This was the best that you could do, monsieur?" she asked at last. "The very best, mademoiselle," I answered calmly. "I do not wish to magnify my service, but it was that or the scaffold. Madame your mother had, unfortunately, seen the king before me, and she had prejudiced your father's case by admitting him to be a traitor. There was a moment when, in view of that, I was almost led to despair. I am glad, however, mademoiselle, that I was so fortunate as to persuade the king to just so much clemency. And for 5 years, then, I shall not see my parents." She sighed, and her distress was very touching. "That need not be. Though they may not come to France, it still remains possible for you to visit them in Spain." "True," she mused. "That will be something, will it not?" "Assuredly something. Under the circumstances, much." She sighed again, and for a moment there was silence. "Will you not sit, monsieur?" said she at last. She was very quiet today, this little maid, very quiet and very wondrously subdued. "There is scarce the need," I answered softly, whereupon her eyes were raised to ask 100 questions. "You are satisfied with my efforts, mademoiselle?" I inquired. "Yes, I am satisfied, monsieur." That was the end, I told myself, and involuntarily I also sighed. Still, I made no shift to go. "You are satisfied that I have fulfilled what I promised?" Her eyes were again cast down, and she took a step in the direction of the window. "But yes, your promise was to save my father from the scaffold. You have done so, and I make no doubt you have done as much to reduce the term of his banishment as lay within your power. Yes, monsieur, I am satisfied that your promise has been well fulfilled." Hi-oh! The resolve that I had formed in coming whispered it in my ear that nothing remained but to withdraw and go my way. Yet not for all that resolve, not for 100 such resolves, could I have gone thus. One kindly word, one kindly glance at least, would I take to comfort me. I would tell her in plain words of my purpose, and she would see that there was still some good, some sense of honor in me, and thus should esteem me after I was gone. "Ganymede," said I, "Monseigneur, bid the men mount." At that she turned, wonder opening her eyes very wide, and her glance travelled from me to Rodnard with its unspoken question. But even as she looked at him, he bowed, and turning to do my bidding, left the room. We heard his steps pass with a jingle of spurs across the hall and out into the courtyard. We heard his raucous voice utter a word of command, and there was a stamping of hoofs, a cramping of harness, and all the bustle of preparation. "Why have you ordered your men to mount?" she asked at last. "Because my business here is ended, and we are going." "Going?" said she. Her eyes were lowered now, but a frown suggested their expression to me. "Going whither?" "Hence," I answered. "That, for the moment, is all that signifies." I paused to swallow something that hindered a clear utterance. Then, "Adieu," said I, and I abruptly put forth my hand. Her glance met mine fearlessly, if puzzled. "Do you mean, monsieur, that you are leaving Lavdin thus?" "So that I leave, what signifies the manner of my going?" "But—" The trouble grew in her eyes. Her cheeks seemed to wax paler than they had been. "But I thought that we made a bargain." "Shh, mademoiselle, I implore you," I cried. "I take shame at the memory of it. almost as much shame as I take at the memory of that other bargain which first brought me to Lavdin. The shame of the former one I have wiped out, although perchance you think it not. I am wiping out the shame of the latter one. It was unworthy in me, mademoiselle, but I loved you so dearly that it seemed to me that no matter how I came by you, I should rest content if I but won you. I have since seen the error of it, the injustice of it. I will not take what is not freely given, and so farewell." I see," she murmured, and ignored the hand that I held out. "I am very glad of it, monsieur." I withdrew my hand sharply. I took up my hat from the chair in which I had cast it. She might have spared me that, I thought. She need not have professed joy. At least she might have taken my hand and parted in kindness. "Adieu, mademoiselle," I said again as stiffly as might be, and I turned towards the door. "Monsieur," she called after me. I halted. "Mademoiselle?" She stood demurely, with eyes downcast and hands folded. "I shall be so lonely here." I stood still. I seemed to stiffen. My heart gave a mad throb of hope, then seemed to stop. What did she mean? I faced her fully once more, and I doubt not I was very pale. Yet, lest vanity should befool me, I dare not act upon suspicions. And so— "True, mademoiselle," said I, "you will be lonely. I regret it." As silence followed, I turned again to the door, and my hopes sank with each step in that direction. "Monsieur!" Her voice arrested me upon the very threshold. "What shall a poor girl do with this great estate upon her hands? It will go to ruin without a man to govern it." "You must not attempt the task. You must employ an attendant." I caught something that sounded oddly like a sob. Could it be? Dieu, could it be after all? Yet I would not presume. I half turned again, but her voice detained me. It came petulantly now. "Monsieur Bardelys, you have kept your promise nobly. Will you ask no payment?" "No, mademoiselle," I answered very softly. "I can take no payment." Her eyes were lifted for a second. Their blue depths seemed dim. Then they fell again. "Oh, why will you not help me?" she burst out, to add more softly, "I shall never be happy without you." "You mean?" I gasped, retracing a step and flinging my hat in a corner. "That I love you, Marcel, that I want you." "And you can forgive? You can forgive?" I cried as I caught her. Her answer was a laugh that bespoke her scorn of everything save us two, of everything save our love. That and the pout of her red lips was her answer, and if the temptation of those lips— But there, I grow indiscreet. Still holding her, I raised my voice. "Ganymede!" I called. "Monseigneur," came his answer through the open window. "Bid those knaves dismount and unsaddle." End of chapter 22. The End of Bardelys the Magnificent by Rafael Sabatini.